Greetings, philosophers. I hope that you are staying hunkered down safe and washing your hands. Wash your hands, always. Today, we're going to wrap up Hume, and we're going to make some critical comments. So today's session should be relatively brief, and then eventually I will post some kind of review. We may do it on Teams, but we'll have a review session for our upcoming exam. So, remember Hume. He was a bit rapscallion, especially when it came to religion. And he, as I mentioned in my introductory lecture, Hume faced his death very calmly. And there's a story that's recounted here. I'm going to share this with you about Boswell, who was Samuel Johnson's biographer. These were very famous people in Hume's day. Anyway, here we go. Boswell, Johnson's biographer, called on Hume a few weeks before Hume's death when he was visibly failing. He was dying of cancer. Under the circumstances, immortality seemed to Boswell an appropriate subject of conversation, and he questioned Hume closely about his beliefs. Was it not possible that there might be a future state, that is, life after death? Yes, Hume replied. It was also possible that a piece of coal put upon the fire would not burn. That men should exist forever was a most unreasonable fancy. The trash of every age must then be preserved, and new universes must be created to contain such infinite numbers. When Boswell inquired whether Hume had ever entertained any belief in religion, Hume replied that, as a child, he passed briefly through a period of piety, worrying greatly about his vices, and especially about his pride. But what a childish folly this was, Hume continued. Why should a boy not be proud who knew that he excelled his fellow students? The trouble with Christianity was that it tried to extinguish instead of moderating the passions, and so ended in immorality. He then said, flatly, that the morality of every religion was bad, and, this is Boswell speaking now, I really thought was not joking when he said, quote, that when he heard a man was religious, he concluded that he was a rascal, though he had known some instances of very good men being religious. More Hume. Now, we have seen that Hume wants to clear the field. Okay? His final jab, his final swipe, is the last paragraph of this book. Remember that one? And the last paragraph on page 114, and I've got it up here on the slide. When we run over libraries, persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it contains nothing but sophistry and delusion. That, of course, is a reference to Hume's fork, right? There are two kinds of thought, reasoning about relations of ideas, reasoning about matters of fact. And if your book contains either one of them, then it contains nothing but sophistry and illusion. Thus ends Hume, except for critical comments. Okay? Let me first of all offer up the general principle, and all of my critical comments are going to focus somehow or relate to this principle. And that is, of course, Hume's copy thesis. All ideas are copies of impressions. This, of course, is the key to his empiricism, and again, all of our criticism is going to be tied to this in some way. In order to get the first one, I'm going to have to explain a notion before I can actually tell you what this is, and this is the idea of self-reference. Okay? Certain sentences or claims refer to themselves. For example, some sentences in English are meaningful. Yes, and that's one of them, right there on the screen, right? That's one of them. Okay? In order to be true, a sentence cannot contradict itself. That is, it cannot be self-referentially inconsistent. If it were so, it would be self-defeating. Some examples of sentences that are self-referentially inconsistent are up here. All words are meaningless. Okay, well, if that's a meaningful sentence, then it's a meaningless sentence, right? Everything is relative. Everything is relative? Well, except that. That's an invariant. Well, if that's not relative, if that isn't relative, then everything isn't relative, right? Nothing is true. Is that true? Of course. Or how about that last one? This sentence is false. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true, right? So here's the claim then. Hume's empiricism is self-referentially inconsistent. Okay? Notice this. All ideas are copies of impressions. Where'd you get that idea from? What impression does the idea of all ideas copy? Can you have an impression of all ideas? Remember the meaning thesis? The meaning of an idea is the impression that it copies. Well, if you can't find a corresponding impression, then the idea is meaningless. Welcome, Mr. Hume. Okay? At best, all Hume could say is, all the ideas I've checked so far have been copies of impressions. But you know what? That's a completely different animal altogether. In other words, how do I verify that I get all ideas from impressions only? Okay? It seems that I get all ideas from impressions except that one. In other words, it defeats itself. It doesn't verify itself. It contradicts itself. Because this isn't something you can learn from experience, right? Notice the corollary. All knowledge comes from experience, can't be learned from experience. Notice, if it's false, if it's meaningful, then it's false. If in fact all knowledge comes from experience, and you can't learn that from experience, then you can't learn that. So it defeats itself. Second, the idea of self. And Hume, he doesn't deal with this in the book we're reading in the Inquiry. But in his bigger book, The Treatise of Human Nature, he spends a lot of time struggling with the idea of self. And how can he count? Remember how in the Inquiry he offered up how he came up with the idea of cause and effect through inner impressions and feeling of expectation, all that. Well, he seems that we have this idea of self. Descartes has the cogito, innate idea in order to do this, right? That's easy. Hume can't have that. So where he finally comes to is saying that we don't have an idea of the self, given that we have no impression of the self. How can you have an impression of the self, right? How can I get the idea of self from experience? I mean, it's an awesome idea, it seems, or do we have it at all? Okay? Hume finally gives up on trying to give an empiricist account of the idea of self, and he says that the self is just a bundle of impressions. But notice this. A bundle of impressions is constantly changing. Okay, check this out. Look at the bottom corner of your screen right there. Right now, I'm having one set of impressions and I'm one bundle. Now, I'm having another set of impressions, a new bundle. Now, another set of impressions, a new bundle. Now, another set of impressions, a new bundle. Thus, I was just four different people. If the self is a bundle of impressions, a different bundle of impression implies a different person. Thus, if after lunch today, I snuck out of my office and went and robbed a gas station down the corner and came back, the police showed up and said, "Dr. Myers, you're under arrest for robbery." I said, "I didn't do that. That was a different bundle of impressions." In other words, if Hume can account for personal identity through time, then moral responsibility is history. And I don't know that that is acceptable. Third, Remember that old missing color example that we fussed about in class? This actually is large, and Hume simply dismisses it. Okay? With that example, Hume identified a very significant feature of the mind that happens all the time. The mind is constantly filling in gaps in our perception. Okay? The ability to do this is a significant feature of the mind, given the limited nature of physical organs. Okay, take our eyesight, for example. I think I said this before. I hope I did. If I didn't, I am now. That our vision is actually a projection of the just past onto the present, because we can't see the present because the present is just now occurring. It hasn't happened yet. So as such, there are gaps in it, there are holes in it that the mind fills in these gaps. So the mind is creative, okay? And the ability to fill in these gaps seems to be a necessary feature of the mind, given again the limited nature of sensory organs. Yet for Hume, okay, for Hume, the mind is just a copying machine that can't really come up with anything new. All it can come up with is new combinations of old things. The creative function of the mind is severely limited, or perhaps even eliminated, in Hume. Yet this is one of the most important features of the mind. The idea of the mind is ridiculously thin. Okay? Finally, Hume's distinction between impressions and ideas. This actually is very sloppy, y'all. Hume has divided experience up into two different sorts of things, a sort of a Cartesian dualism, dare I say it. But think about it. An impression is an immediate experience. But if I close my eyes and I imagine something, that's an immediate experience. Interesting. That is, that too is a vivid impression. The process of thinking is itself a process of having impressions so that we can have impressions of ideas. Okay? This very neat distinction that Hume drew is not so neat of a distinction. In fact, it's downright blurry and messy in experience. Thus we have Hume. I will very shortly put up a review and we'll talk about the exam. I've already posted, though I haven't made public yet, a multiple choice true-false portion for that exam that you're going to do on the Moodle. And we will talk about the essays. I gave you the study questions. I hope you're working on those, or we will be fairly soon. Our exam's still a little ways off, not too long, but that will be scheduled somewhere between the 9th and the 9th and the 13th of April. So you have a couple of weeks there about that. Have a great one. Stay safe and wash your hands.